Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very interesting and very timely program on a talk on sisters, not strangers, how interfaith relations can go deeper. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies at Liverpool Hope University. My name is Salman Al-Azami. I'm the Deputy Director of the Centre. I'm also a senior lecturer in English language at Liverpool Hope. So I'll just say a few words about our center, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies. So we are proud to bring together academics and practitioners who work on issues related to peace, war, and conflict from a variety of perspectives. The center promotes the benefit of drawing on interdisciplinary approaches to shed light on the multidimensional challenges that are faced by militarism and deeply divided societies. We aim to promote cooperation between academics and practitioners to enable innovative and original research projects, outputs, and impact. At the same time, we believe in the importance of linking academic research to the lived realities of societies emerging from conflict. The center, therefore, aims to strengthen the links between theory and practice, inviting academics and practitioners alike to engage in its diverse activities. And as part of that activity, today we are having a practitioners event, and we welcome Julie Siddiqi and Lindsay Simmonds to share their experience of working together in terms of friendship, interfaith relationship, and sisterly relationship, everything. So just one or two housekeeping matters. This program is being recorded. However, only the speakers' views are recorded. So just to be aware, we are going to share our recorded version with the permission of the speakers on our YouTube channel. But only the main discussion will be recorded, not the question and answer session. So if you are concerned about you being recorded, it's not going to be shown in the recording, because the main speakers will be speaking and the question and answer session will not be recorded. In terms of the question and answers, the structure of this today's event will be, first I will invite Lindsay Simmonds to speak, followed by Julie Siddiqi individually, and after that, we'll ask them to actually share their experience working together. So it will be 15 minutes of each speaker and then 15 minutes together. So that will lead to 45 minutes. After that, we will open it for questions. In terms of question and answers, I'd like to request you to message me privately on the chat, just to say that I would like to ask a question so that I have your names. So privately, please send a message to say that you want to ask a question, that I can give you the floor. In terms of your being camera on is fine. You can turn your camera on and off, that's not a problem, but please keep yourself muted all the time unless you are given a floor to ask questions. So with these introductions, I would like to first introduce our speaker, Dr. Lindsay Simmonds, who is a research fellow at the London School of Jewish Studies, where she has lectured, written, and convened courses for almost 20 years, focusing on women in biblical narrative and women in Jewish law and the Talmud. She has also lectured for King's College London, the United Synagogue, and at Jewish communities throughout the UK. She speaks at national and international conferences on Judaism and gender, on peaceful shared society and conflict negotiation. Lindsay is currently involved in several national and international interfaith projects, including co-chair of a local Jewish Muslim women's network, Nisa Nashim, a trustee for the Abraham Initiative UK, and Jewish scholar in residence for the Council of Christians and Jews. Lindsay received her PhD from the LSE's Department of Gender in January 2020. Her research is entitled Generating Piety, Agency in the Lives of British Orthodox Jewish Women. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Lindsay to give a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation to share what I consider actually one of my most important and deep friendships. So we've been asked to introduce ourselves to enable the participants to get to know us a little bit, and perhaps how we got to the interfaith world. So I won't start right at the beginning, but I will give you a little biography so everyone can get a feel for how I suppose, the process of life and the challenges enable one to take certain journeys. Okay, so I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I belong to an Orthodox Jewish community within Northwest London. And to some extent, I straddle several worlds. That's part of my identity. Also, I'm part of the academic community, both at the LSE and at LSJS. And of course, I also work in the interfaith world, as has been said, and I'll get to that a bit later. I was brought up in Northwest London, which has many Jewish communities within it. And I myself am not from a religious home. In fact, I might argue that it wasn't even a very traditional Jewish home. But nevertheless, I very much enjoyed going to what we call cheder, which you might call Sunday school, something like that, where I did learn Jewish studies, and I very much enjoyed that. And at the end of my primary school, I wanted to continue that learning, that Jewish learning, more than I had had at school, and asked my parents if I could go to a Jewish high school. I think I must have read too much Enid Blyton, wanted to go to boarding school. And there was at the time, it no longer exists, a Jewish boarding school in Oxfordshire called Carmel College. And although that was run under Orthodox auspices, there were many, many different types of Jews there. And so I was there for high school. And in a sense, it was a very idyllic school. It was in the countryside. I played lots of hockey and tennis. But at the same time, I was exposed to different parts of Orthodox life. I got a vision of life that I didn't get at home. And that included particularly the Sabbath, Shabbat, where we were very observant in terms of sharing meals together, going to synagogue together, and keeping the laws of the Sabbath, which mean we don't engage generally in the work that we do during the week, but we have time off and we relax. And that had a huge impact on my life. But it was a slow journey. That was my entire high school career from 10 till 17. So it wasn't an overnight experience, but a long journey to a more religious life. After school, I went to seminary in Jerusalem. And I went to a seminary that was especially created for young women who had not been brought up in a Jewish traditional home, and whose learning, one might say, what their religious learning, was something quite new to them. And although I'd had some background, I'd had very little background. And I spent a year there. And although in the end, the lifestyle that they promoted, which was more in the ultra Orthodox style of Orthodox Judaism, was not something I pursued, that experience was very transformational. It also opened my eyes to the different kinds of orthodoxy that were espoused, especially in Jerusalem. And that was very helpful for me, especially going forward. I came back to the UK, I did a degree in speech and language pathology, I got married. And after that, my husband and I together went back to Jerusalem and decided that we would spend 5 years studying. And we were very privileged to receive scholarships to be able to do that, which we received on condition that we would come back to be educators of some kind in the UK community. And I was, whilst I was there, I was at two institutions, one called Nishmat and one called Midreshet Lindenbaum. And both of these institutions are the bastions, really, of women's study of Torah, of Jewish studies in Jerusalem. And they also promote women and women's learning to a very deep degree, I would say, very significant change from perhaps the traditional learning that women had done until that point. So there's been quite a radical shift with regard to what women are allowed to access in terms of sacred texts. And these two schools were particularly influential in the trajectory changing in general, and specifically to myself. And that has a huge impact on my life up until today. And those two institutions are institutions which I'm still very in touch with, which still impact my life today, which impact the lives of my children, and actually which impact the Orthodox Jewish world in terms of women's study of Torah, women's leadership, women's authority within religious life. So I wanted to mention those specifically as very impactful. And when I returned to the UK with my husband, we took up the position of Rabbi and Rebbetzin as leaders in a community, as it happens, also just outside Northwest London in Watford. And during my time there, I became associated with LSJS, the London School of Jewish Studies, where, as you've been told, I convened and taught courses, but especially with regard to women and Orthodox life. One might say gender and Judaism, feminism and orthodoxy. And I specifically looked at text. I looked at text, biblical text and legal text and Talmudic text about women and their lives. During that time, I was very much asked questions. And again, in terms of transformational moments in life, as I said, in Israel, those 5 years, but this work too transformed the way I thought about Orthodox life from the questions that I received from my students. And they asked me many questions about women, their role, their place, their access to text especially, and obviously the way in which we analyze text. And it was because of that that I was led to thinking about gender in a wider way and applied to do a master's degree at the LSE's Gender Institute. And from that experience, I then stayed to do a PhD. So I've been hanging around the LSE for about 10 years, but I'm finally finished my PhD, which is very exciting. But this PhD was, the research was about British Orthodox Jewish women and their lives in the UK. And given that I've really been investigating this, I think that the interfaith work that I also began to do at this time was very much a part of my understanding of how women functioned in traditional, one might say patriarchal, and certainly Abrahamic faiths. And I think that had a big impact again on my friendship and collegiality with women of other faith. So I've got about 3 minutes left. So I'm just going to talk about the interfaith work then since then. So alongside the educational and academic work that I was doing, I became interested in the interfaith world, but especially really, as I said, with women. And that culminated really in several trips. One to East Belfast to look at the Skenos programme and conflict negotiation and how that had worked and been worked out to some extent in Ireland. I became part of something called the Senior Faith Leadership Programme, originally called the Cambridge Coexist Leadership Programme, and which Julie and I met again, but she'll tell you about that in a moment. And I certainly became very interested in Israel-Palestine conflict negotiation work with something called the UK Task Force and with the CCJ, the Council of Christians and Jews. And I went on several trips with other leaders of faith, and during those trips, we worked very hard to establish collegiality and friendship to enable us to develop the conversations that needed to be had. In addition to that, I have a very close relationship with the LSE Faith Centre. They also put on a programme for students with regard to a trip to the Israel-Palestine region, and they take Jewish and Palestinian students, which I have to say is an astonishing feat and the first of its kind. They also offer very many programmes at the Faith Centre for the Commonwealth Office and so on and so forth for students. And I've been very much a part of that. And with regard to voluntary work, so as was noted earlier, I'm the co-chair of my local Nisan Nashim. And I also am a trustee at the Abraham Initiative, which encourages shared society in Israel for citizens of Israel. So that is both Israeli Jews, Israeli Arab Muslims, and Israeli Arab Christians, etc. And lastly, I'm the scholar in residence for the CCJ. Through all of this work is how I met the lovely Julie, who will speak in a moment, and then we will talk about our blossoming relationship. But that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. You've got a wealth of experience, and thanks for sharing some of them. And congratulations for your PhD. We always say this is lifelong learning, and this never ends. So anyone who aspires to complete their PhD, shouldn't wait. Shouldn't think that, oh, I'm too old to do anything. So any degree. My wife took 18, 19 years gap and then did a master's degree last year. So it's just, learning never ends. So thank you for your, introduction and letting us know about your background. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, Julie Siddiqi MBE, who is a mentor, consultant, and gender equality campaigner with a background in grassroots community organizing spanning 25 years. She has a specific focus on Jewish, Muslim, and other interfaith relations, and on applying that to social action work together. Julie is co-founder of the Big Iftar, which during Ramadan has seen hundreds of grassroots community events take place around the UK. She's a regular voice on BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day. Julie is founder and director of Sadaqah Day, a one-day Muslim-led focus on social action, which was launched in March 2015, and she is co-founder of Nisa Nashim, the Jewish and Muslim Women's Network, the largest network of its kind in Europe. Julie has recently established, together with Thrive, a UK network and online platform to train and inspire Muslim women to fully participate in society at every level, to challenge patriarchal attitudes in all communities, and to ensure Muslim women are better represented in print and TV media. Julie was awarded an MBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List 2020 for services to promoting interfaith understanding. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Julie to present.
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Honestly, it's such an honor to be here, and particularly speaking alongside Lindsay, who of course, as always, sets the bar very high and leaves me to present myself. So what we thought we would do is to speak about ourselves, because I think it's important for you to kind of get a sense of who we are individually and how our lives kind of come together. And then we'll talk after I've spoken a bit more about the specifics of that. And I'm very excited to do that. So I'm actually going to share my screen. I've got some PowerPoint slides, mainly because 15 minutes. And so I thought I'd try and behave myself and not talk too much. So this is my mum's favorite picture of me when I was like 4 years old. You can see all of my lovely red hair. I was born in Chertsey in Surrey, and similar, I guess, in some ways. Lindsay was saying that there was no kind of religion in that sense, and certainly in our house we didn't have the God discussion really at all. Can't go into it all now, but I found faith. I became a Muslim, or certainly became interested when I was about 19, and then I actually left it a few years wondering whether I'm doing the right thing or not, and it eventually converted in 1995. I got married, moved to Slough, where I still live now. Very happily married, thank God, alhamdulillah, 4 children later. And I think slowly developed my understanding of service and working with people, and still doing it now and still love it. And very much for me, a focus on the aspects of putting our faith into action. So it's not just theory, but actually that we, really should be kind of out there and putting our faith into action. And very much, as was mentioned earlier, that life is certainly a journey, and one that we should see ourselves as traveling through, and always on a kind of mission to learn. I'm not going to go into all of the detail of all of this, but just to sort of give a sense of, 1.7 billion people in like 2 minutes is not going to do it justice, but I just wanted to at least kind of mention it so that people have it in their mind. 1.7 billion people identify around the world as Muslims, certainly very much part of the Abrahamic religions. We worship one God. We call that God Allah, but actually it's the same God as other people talk about. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was certainly the last of the prophets, but we very much believe in all of the prophets, including Jesus, peace be upon them all. The Quran itself was revealed to Muhammad from God and has never changed. And just a little note here, if you want to listen to someone talk brilliantly about this topic, please go and listen to Cat Stevens on Desert Island Disc recently. Does a fantastic kind of whistle-stop tour of his relationship with the Quran, which is a really lovely thing to listen to, alongside, of course, all of his music choices. And of course, there are Muslims all over the world, and with that comes the cultural expressions, which vary from place to place in the most fascinating way. Diversity is very much seen as a positive, as very much part of, you know, who we are as Muslims, that we're from different parts of the world. And of course, with that comes the complexities of diversity, which has its positives and negatives in the way it plays out in people's lives. So for example, people like to hold on to one particular way of doing things. And of course, when you're in different countries, it really should be taking on the flavor and the feel of those countries. And that's something that is very much there as part of Islam as a faith. And just to say about Muslims in the UK, and let me just start off by saying there is no such thing as the Muslim community. We are about as diverse and have much of a spectrum as you could probably think about. People from all over the world are in the UK and identify as Muslim. The migration journey, I guess, was very significant in terms of numbers, because a lot of people came here, particularly from South Asia, mostly arriving in the 60s. And more than half of the UK Muslims are under the age of 25, so a very young population. With that, of course, comes its generational challenges, the issues around culture versus religion, how things are perceived, and actually how that fits into a wider conversation, I think, in the UK about faith, which, you know, goes up and down and has its moments, I guess. And then, of course, I would say prejudice. And again, we can't go into all of this. This is a whole topic for another day. But certainly if you imagine the young people that I'm talking about have never known anything other than the spotlight of after 9/11 and the kind of war on terror and all of the kind of hard and difficult things that has brought, and they've never actually known any different. I think that's just worth mentioning. And I say here, what can we do? And really, again, if we had more time, we could go into this, but I just wanted to sort of give a sense of, in a way, where I'm coming from, and how I think that we as people, all of us, and certainly I see this very much as part of my faith, but I think it's something that all of us need to be consciously thinking about. And in a way, this sums up a lot of how I feel and how I think about the world, that we should be more curious, that we have to be changed. So it's no good complaining and having a kind of victim mentality, but that actually we need to be thinking about what can we do as an individual or together with others and change things for the better. I think I'm an optimistic realist, so I understand that there are issues, I understand that things are difficult, I understand that people don't always get on, but I do like to think of myself as an optimist. And I love what Barack Obama said when he talked about the audacity of hope. Can we possibly have the audacity to have hope even when times are very, very difficult? And of course, when people go low, as the other Obama said, we go higher. And that's, I mention it because I think it's sometimes easy for us to all go down there. And sometimes if we're being criticized or if there's horrible stuff happening, it sometimes might be easier for us to go down with it. But actually, we need to be able to be people who rise above it. I just wanted to very quickly mention a few of the things that I really feel very strongly and passionate about, because I think it's all relevant to think about where I got to and how I sort of live my life. And again, I very much feel very strongly about putting our faith into action. So you can see that I've done some work around knife crime and young people. As was mentioned earlier, do broadcasting, certainly got absolutely stuck into the work last year locally with regards to helping people through COVID. And then relevant to these, and sorry, the pictures aren't very clear, coming up very clear on here, but relevant to this conversation, of course, is you mentioned Sadaqah Day, and Sadaqah Day, the word Sadaqah is often thought about as charity or giving money. And for me, Sadaqah needs to be much more than that. So Sadaqah Day was very much actually in line with Mitzvah Day, which is very much a day of Jewish social action. And I saw it working really well. And this is an example of a Jewish and Muslim communities coming together to do some good stuff. So whether that be feeding the homeless or other things. And then the big iftar, and I mentioned, I've got this picture here because you can see there an iftar at a synagogue. And when we first started the Big Iftar, it was really always about getting Muslims to open up Ramadan more. You know, we're very good at sharing it with each other as Muslims and feeding each other, because there's a lot of blessing in that, and that's great. Actually, this was about saying, look, can you possibly open up Ramadan more and share it more with your neighbors and invite people in and be, you know, much more open. What I wasn't expecting, honestly wasn't expecting, were things like this, you know, for synagogues to contact me to say, we want to host an iftar. Now, if you imagine what that signifies, it's honestly amazing. When you think about people who are, and within that, you know, within that synagogue community, in this case or in others, there will of course be people who are saying, why would you do that here? Why would we want those people here? Of course, there'll be those conversations, and similarly the other way around, if we were to do something similar in a mosque, for example. But I think it's really about leadership, and it's really about people connecting as friends and developing that trust. And that's where all of these events came from, in the most amazing way, including cathedrals and town squares and, you know, all sorts of places. Schools have hosted iftar, and that for me is a very, very beautiful thing. And of course, this year, again, as last year, we'll probably be in lockdown again for Ramadan, but let's see. And just to very briefly mention, sort of leading in really to the bit that we're going to talk about in a minute, other passions of mine around interfaith work, but also within my own community, very much in a way. One of the things that I love about Lindsay and some of the other people that she kind of hangs out with, and one of the highlights for me of this whole sort of 11 years of friendship, has been mixing and hanging out and getting an understanding from, you know, Orthodox Jewish women who see themselves as challenging the status quo around gender, feminists, I guess. And you know, when I met those people, I literally felt like I had come home, because they are talking and challenging and pushing back on issues within the Jewish community in the same way that I am in the Muslim community when it comes to things around leadership, prayer, etc. So it was fascinating for me, and probably, as I say, one of the highlights for me of this whole friendship is really about that. So I very much see, you know, myself as someone who is part of the community. You know, if someone was to say to me, well, why don't you just leave, because it's so frustrating, and why should I leave? You know, my faith is really important to me, but what I do think is there needs to be people like me to challenge stuff from the inside. So things around mosques, you know, why is it that 1/3 of British mosques or UK mosques don't even have a space for women to pray? Again, a whole other topic for another day. But, you know, these things can't just be left going. We have to be able to challenge and speak about these things. And then top right, you can see myself and Laura Marks there, and we were the co-founders of Nisa Nashim. And really it started through conversations that we were having. We were doing similar sort of social action work together, and then realized that actually there were some of these commonalities within the communities, the positives and maybe some of the negatives, and that maybe, just maybe, as women, we could do things differently. And there's certainly a great heritage, I guess, of this, as Lindsay mentioned earlier about going to Northern Ireland, and of course actually around the world, when you see places in conflict or communities that are not getting on, actually often it can be women that kind of get it together and rise up and sort of do things differently. So I think it was really coming from that kind of thinking that we felt that there was something here. And right from the start, when we started it and did our first couple of events, and loads of people came and loads of people got it, that it was amazing, because we just thought, wow, we are really onto something here, and people really do want to, you know, to engage with this, and they see something in it that we do as well. And just to say generally, really, the sort of Jewish and Muslim stuff, we're talking about lots of positive things here, and rightly so, and there's lots in common and there's lots of similarities. We also mentioned about the sort of communal stuff when it comes to things around leadership, and we've got commonality there, which often people don't think of. You know, there's very much a narrative out there, the poor Muslim women that need saving from themselves, and Muslim women will say, we don't need saving, we're not oppressed, we know what we want, we just need to have the conversation, you need to listen to us, we need to work together. And so by working with women, Jewish women, and also women from other faith backgrounds, I think it's really, really positive. I put geography as a barrier because, of course, as Lindsay has already alluded to just in her own story, many Jews, for example, live in North London. There's pockets of Jewish communities in Birmingham, in Leeds, in Bradford, in places where there's amazing history, amazing stories. And I would urge any of you to look into some of that history, because, of course, the migration element of it, and why so many people from the Jewish community came into Britain in the first place, and where did they come? Of course, East London and lots of those places, and who lives in East London now, all sorts of different communities. So there's a great kind of similar sort of story in a way. But of course, there's different parts of it too. And geography I put as a barrier because I know when I was growing up, and even where I live now, there really isn't a Jewish community at all. So I had to make an effort in that sense to actually even meet people if that's what I wanted to do. So I think it can be a barrier, and we need to be creative and think about what we do with that. If we're in a situation where we haven't got other people from different backgrounds to mix with, then we really need to be thinking about how we kind of get over that. Anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred, of course, in some ways there are similarities, in other ways they're very, very different. And so the mistake would be to kind of lump them all together. At the same time, yes, we have to fight for each other. Yes, we have to call it out. But I think the most important thing about both of these actually is the education, the understanding, the listening. If someone says, if a Jewish person says, I feel offended by this or that, we have to listen. You have to listen to what someone is saying and not then try and say, well, no, actually, why would you feel offended by that? And similarly, the other way around. And we need to do that with people that are calling anything out. We need to be the ones that listen more than we actually speak. This whole narrative around they never get on has perpetuated, certainly since I've been Muslim, and I guess all of my life, I've always heard this narrative that, oh, they've never got on, they'll never get on. And of course, a lot of that is based around what's happening in other parts of the world, in Israel and other places. And I've always felt really strongly that my focus needs to be on my life here. Of course, that's not to say that I deny what's happening. I don't think about what's happening in other parts of the world. But I think in order to move forward, I always felt there was a need for me to look much broader and to really look at how to connect with people on a very personal level. I think the leadership around all of this has been super weak, frankly. And so that's why I feel actually very proud of the work that we've done here on this as women, because I think the leadership generally here and around the world on trying to bring these two communities together, or even give people the kind of permission in a way to do it, I think has been very weak and still is. And I think that's a shame. Of course, there's a challenge here around Muslims and Israel. Of course there is. And I just name it and put it on the table. And there'll be challenges the other way around as well. But I'm speaking as a Muslim. I hear the stories, I hear the narrative, I hear the misconceptions, I hear the stereotypes, and yes, I hear the anti-Semitism. And of course, what we have to do is then be able to acknowledge where's that coming from, what's bringing that out of people, and how do we sort of move forward? Because again, for me, it's all about how we're going to move forward, not about denying what people are saying, not about the fact that people are feeling, if they feel there's injustice, we just close that down. But it's about how do we do that? And that's what I feel is really very powerful within the Nisana Sheen kind of framework. And just to finish by saying that one of our main focuses, Laura and I and all of us involved right from the start, has been very much this idea of friendship. So putting friendship right at the heart of what we do, not making it a kind of secondary thing, and saying to people, put that at the heart of what you do, make that a priority, develop the relationships, just like you do with any other friendships. And then you can build on it, build the trust and build the respect going forward. So that's me done. I'm just going to finish with a quote from a rabbi, of course, but it's such a powerful quote. And of course, based on what I have said, it really is very, very significant. It's about us thinking about what we can do and not always thinking about it as what other people could do, but and when, what are we waiting for? In a way, if we're thinking about making change and doing things differently, what are we waiting for? Waiting for other people to do it. If we wait for other people to do things, often we'll be waiting a very long time. So it's very much about personal responsibility and connecting those dots up. And my 15 minutes is up. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And that was my whistle-stop tour of my almost 50 years of life. But hopefully that gave you a sense of who I am. And together you can see that actually we have very different lives and we're quite different people, but have a very, very tight friendship that really means a great deal to both of us. So Salman, do you want us to kind of move into that now? Or?
Yes, thank you, Julie. I mean, this was really, I've already, I've written down a few questions myself, really, really intrigued by your background. So there is a commonality in the sense of both of you were actually initially brought up in a really non-faith background, but then how you found faith, in different ways. And I think there are fascinating things in it. And I have some questions, but I would prefer the audience to ask questions first before I take my questions, but these questions can be asked after the next stage of our talk today to just try to know about your, how you actually came together. Of course, you co-founded when I first came to know about Nisana Sheen, I got really fascinated about this because I think in both the communities, there is this type of the otherness, the feeling of otherness, and we don't know each other. And then they are, to be honest, I come from Bangladesh, and before coming abroad, first I went to America. That's the first time I saw a Jewish person myself in person, and that type of perceptional issues, I think, would be very interesting to know how you two met and how you are getting along and how your friendship developed and how you're working together. After that, as I mentioned in the chat as well, if you send me a private chat just to let me know that you want to ask a question, then I'll give you the floor after. So yes, it's up to Julie and Lindsay now to.
So I'll respond for a couple of minutes to what Julie said, but in the framework of our friendship, and then I think Julie might do the same, and then we'll just chat about ourselves, which is a strange thing to do in public, but there you go. First of all, Julie, thank you. Beautiful presentation. I really wanted to say, in terms of what Julie said, when she talked about faith in action, actually doing something, two things. First of all, the director of the Department of Gender, Claire Hemmings, has on her door, "Theory saves lives," which I always think was a fabulous quote. But it means that there are different ways of engaging in the world. And of course, to some extent, my engagement has been academic and written and sort of esoterical to some, on the one hand. But on the other hand, we have this, this action-based motivation. I think both Julie and she just quoted Hillel, and I was going to quote response really to Julie mentioning Barack Obama, and the questions of hope, this word hope. And the now late Emeritus Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks talked in his book about the difference between optimism and hope. And optimism, he says, is sort of the hope that someone else will do something. Basically, you can be optimistic, you can look out onto the world and see good, but not do much about it. Be optimistic about the future, but not create the future. Whereas he suggested the difference was that hope means I have an obligation. I have an obligation to do something myself, to pass on something to the next generation. That is what hope is. Hope is, as it were, optimism in action. So in response to Julie's faith in action, I feel very strongly that that is a real bedrock of our relationship, the doing of stuff. And in addition to that, the doing of stuff doesn't always have to be, and I think this may be the point we get to at the end of this evening, is that it doesn't always have to be, social action. It doesn't always have to be a project. It doesn't have to be that we're changing the world, even in small incremental steps. In Nisa Nashim, for example, in Edgware, one of the things we do is we sit in a local cafe, a local kosher cafe, so everyone can sit together and eat and drink together. But what is wonderful about that is the normalization and the ordinariness of the friendships. We're not doing anything, we're being together. And I feel that that is something that Nisa Nashim and ordinary friendship is about. And I also wanted to mention, given that you mentioned Obama, Julie, and other things, I kind of feel that there's a kind of politicization of these friendships in the sense of liberal, open, pink and fluffy, friendships that are all about looking at the world in a kind of genteel and promising way. But actually I feel that our relationships are much more robust and difficult in a good way. We wrangle, we rant, we discuss, we challenge, and it doesn't come from a place, personally, I can't speak for Julie, she'll speak for herself, of a place of trying to make the world flatter and less problematic in what we are faced with, but better in the way in which we deal and respond to things. And in that regard, there's not a flattening of our identities or a flattening of political difficulties or religious difficulties. There's just an improvement in the quality of the conversation. And I'm just going to end, I think, with a Jewish idea, which is from Deuteronomy, the last book of the Bible for us. Well, I'll say it in Hebrew for you. Love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And that is not something, again, that is some kind of political, social cultural issue. It may be all of those things too, but for us it's a religious fundamental, and that we reach out to other people is something that is, I feel, not particularly highlighted a lot of the time. And maybe what we're doing is just taking scripture that is there and present and has always been there, and just highlighting it. Okay, Julie.
Yeah, well, anyone who's listening to Lindsay knows why she is absolutely my friend. I just want to give a few kind of things that come to mind when I think about. We actually first met in, we think it's 2010. It could have been 2009, I haven't checked. But it was at an event which was organised by a kind of a feminist organisation, and they were doing talks from different faith perspectives around gender and all of the things that come with that. And the reason it was really significant, certainly a moment for me, was I found it quite emotional and quite moving. That's why I kind of remember it, because there were, I think for me, it was a point of readiness. Anyone who's been at that kind of moment where you go to something or you meet people and there's something just falls into place. And there was just a moment for me there where I realized, wow, we're all talking pretty much about the same sort of stuff here in terms of the challenges, as well as the sort of beautiful teachings and all of that. Actually, some of the really challenging stuff that we face as women in our communities or in the world, we're all pretty much talking about the same thing here in different ways. It was really quite a moment for me. And then we were really lucky to then come back into contact with each other as part of the Faith in Leadership program that we were really blessed to be a part of, which was essentially leaders from three faiths, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, coming together in some of the most fantastic environments that you could possibly think of, and sharing time, getting to know each other, but also learning about leadership through a faith lens with other people from different faiths. And Lindsay and I were on the same group, the same year group for that. And we were the first year to do it. So it was all very trial and error. And we hit it off straight away, and haven't been sort of separated since. And there's a few other moments that I just want to mention in terms of just to illustrate the kind of things that we're talking about. And I often say to people that haven't perhaps delved into kind of interfaith work or whatever, that just by the way, when we're talking about friendships, we don't sit and talk about Torah and Bible, although sometimes, of course, that does come up. We're much more likely to be talking about Jeremy and Nav or the kids, or, you know, our most recent conversation, which was super rushed because she had to go somewhere, so did I, was about how are you coping, who's struggling in the house, where do you sit and do your work, have you got any work done, she's staying up super late, I'm getting up really early. That stuff is what also bonds people together, right? Because that's what friendships are about, and also a bit of a moan about things, and you know, we've done all of it. So I think it's just important to realize that there's not this kind of like idealistic way of doing things. If you actually take it down to friendship, that's where you build the trust. Another thing that came to mind was Lindsay's son's wedding. Nav and I went to it, and it was a brilliant experience and amazing. The thing that comes to mind for me, anybody who's familiar with Jewish weddings will know that there's lots of dancing, and the men in particular get very, very kind of excited, and there's a lot of dancing. My husband, on the other hand, has literally 2 left feet and can't dance to literally save his life. And the rabbi, Harvey, who's also a friend of ours, kind of pulled him in to this circle of spiraling men going around very fast, and he just got caught up with it. Probably one of the most brilliant moments that I'll always remember. And then there's a couple of serious things that I just want to throw in here, and then maybe Lindsay can sort of respond to these as well. I remember there was one time when we were sitting, and it was part of the sort of alumni of that program that I mentioned, and Lindsay and myself, and actually a Shia Muslim man, if you kind of picture it, was sitting in a room, and we had developed this link and friendship and trust, and we were having a conversation about all sorts of things. And if you kind of imagine the different contexts and things that we come from. And then Lindsay, I remember in that conversation, opened up about one of her friends being killed by a suicide bomber in Israel when she was on a bus. And, you know, for somebody, I mean, I feel, you know, emotional thinking about it now, but for her to be able to say it, and for us to be able to somehow talk about it or let it land in the room, and for us to feel trust that we could have a conversation about something so really big as that, is a very special moment, you know, and those things don't come about by themselves. You have to be able to create that trust for someone to be able to share something that they don't know what the other people are going to make of it. And that I think was also very, very powerful. And then just to finish with when the Pittsburgh synagogue shootings happened in, I think it was 2018, something like that. I remember when I heard about it, and of course stuff happens all the time in the world, but it really, really made an impact on me. I cried by myself. I'm sharing it with all of you, but I cried because and it wasn't about, you know, you have to make a statement now as a faith leader and what are you going to say about the fact that there was a Pittsburgh, you know, shooting in a synagogue. The reason I cried and the reason I really struggled with it is because I was thinking about people like Lindsay and her family. They would be the people who'd have been in that synagogue on that day. I've been in synagogues like that here and in America, and so I could literally feel it and picture it just like I would if it was in another place of worship or mosque or whatever. That's what really made an impact on me, the kind of thinking about it from a personal perspective. And then to sort of flip it around and give another example, in March 2019, of course, you'll remember the shootings in New Zealand of the in the mosque, or the two mosques, where 50 people were killed. And the first person to call me was Lindsay on that morning, and she was on the school run, and she called me, and I felt, you know, at that morning, as many Muslims will agree with, you know, I felt really angry. I felt upset. The reason I felt angry was, why is anyone surprised that this has happened? Of course, this was about to happen. The far right and those kind of movements have been targeting and speaking about Muslims in a very bad way for a very long time, and everyone's kind of had their eye off it. And of course, something like that's going to happen, you know. But what Lindsay did for me that day was, again, held the space for me to be angry. I cried out of frustration, and you know, she just was able to hold the space for me to let me get all of that out. You know, it was a very, very important moment for me, because it had all just happened and you're hearing all the news unraveling and you're not really sure what to make of it. And of course it's very far away, but it felt very personal because it could have been a mosque here, and there was a lot of fear about, you know, other attacks here and all that kind of stuff, and no security in the mosques, and what are we going to do about that? So I think it was just a really significant moment for me that I'll always remember, because of the fact that it was very real, and you know, I wasn't hiding anything. I let my anger out, but most importantly, I would say she, you know, Lindsay allowed that to come out, and you know, it really did mean a lot to me. So those are just some of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about today.
And I'll jump in there. You let us know when we've had our 15 minutes, Salman. It's very interesting because two of the stories, I wrote down several stories that I thought people might want to hear about. And I have those two stories too. So my one son's wedding, and speaking about a dear friend who was killed while studying in Jerusalem. And what I wanted to say about those, well, there's several things to say, obviously, and Julie has expressed them beautifully. But what is interesting is these meetings that we have, these interfaith kind of constructed projects that we do, they lead to us meeting each other. So they might be social projects, political projects, you know, UK-wide interfaith projects. But what they lead to is a sense of collegiality. And sometimes, not always, you don't become besties with everyone you meet, but that collegiality will and can, certainly in our case, lead to a friendship. And then what that friendship does is lead to trust. Or perhaps you might say the trust leads to friendship, but I think they really come together. I can't disentangle those myself. What happens is when you have that trust and you have that friendship, then you do have these long-term, deep, meaningful relationships that aren't just about the project you started with or where you met, right? They're about an entire life full of relationship. And I feel that is really what happened in our case. And that meant that for Julie to be invited to my son's wedding, you know, as a guest, She wasn't coming as a token Muslim. I'm saying all the stuff people don't want to say, right? She doesn't come because, oh, look, Lindsay's got a Muslim friend, which is stuff you hear from people. You'd be surprised, even in some of the places I work. But I don't even know what that is anymore. But Julie came because she's Julie. Nevertheless, I called Julie in advance, and this is really what I wanted to say. Doesn't mean some of the issues go away just because it works for us, just because we've got to a place where we have this comfort, we stand up in public and talk about our friendship, which is a strange thing to do in some regard. But stuff, and I mean the stuff of everything that people have in their minds, the biases and perceptions, some of that still remains. So I had to make 2 phone calls before the wedding. The first phone call was to Julie to say that if, when she gets to the synagogue, the security give her a hard time, just call me, okay? Because they will. If you get to a synagogue in the United Kingdom, they give you a hard time if you've never been to a synagogue. If you look like Julie does, with a veil over her head, they have all those preconceived ideas about what is a Muslim doing in my space. And I had to call Julie and say, it might happen. I'm warning you. And then, of course, I also had to call the synagogue. And I called the synagogue. I said, look, just be nice, please. I've got quite a lot of friends coming, and some of them might not look the way you anticipate. So please be lovely to them and gentle and kind and warm, right? But even though both of those conversations took place and everything, of course, luckily was beautiful and ran smoothly on the day, I still had to make those phone calls. So what I want to say is that although we have been blessed with this fabulous friendship, the reality of the situation may not change, in all places at all times immediately as it has done for us. So there's a reality there. And the other story that you spoke of, Julie, about my friend Elisa Flatto, who was a student in Jerusalem studying at one of the schools I mentioned, we actually went on to have a further conversation. And we spoke about how in her case, she was killed through shrapnel to her brain. She was just 20, and all her bodily organs were fine. And the family wanted to donate those organs. And we spoke about how it works in Israeli hospitals with regard to the donation of organs, that there's a hierarchical list. And on that list are Palestinian children, Palestinian adults, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Muslims, Israeli Christians, those with no faith at all, right? There's a hierarchy, as there would be in any hospital. And that led to this incredibly, I would say, fantastic conversation that is very hard to have in other spaces. In other words, I didn't come across, I hope, as like defending anybody, as a Jew might do when we're talking about the state of Israel. But don't you know that this is what goes on? It wasn't like that. It wasn't that conversation. We just shared what happened in that story. And then that story enabled us to discuss the meta issues, but in a space of incredible trust. And the last thing I wanted to respond to Julie, when she talked about leaving, here are we ranting on about women being able to study perhaps a sacred text, to engage in ritual participation, to achieve positions of leadership and authority. And she mentioned leaving. Why don't you leave? If the Orthodox community within which you practice is difficult in terms of these issues, just leave. And I remember the late great educator Maureen Kendler, who's also a mutual friend, was also a mutual friend. She gave a talk in JDove. It's like a TED talk in the Jewish community, and she said that we're not threatening to leave, we're threatening to stay. And there's something that I feel in terms of not just friendship but collegiality with Julie, that we're partners in crime. And I really don't mean crime, I mean actually hopefully religious joy and practice. But there's something about the threatening to stay, about making it work, about encouraging each other, about enabling a space for these conversations to happen, not just within your own community.
Thank you. Julie, do you want to add anything, or should we move on?
Let's open it up. Let's see what everyone else.
So thank you both. I mean, this is so fascinating. Before I go into the question and answers, I just want to, take the liberty of adding a couple of points myself with my own experience, in my professional experience. I I've had, I wrote a book called Religion in the Media, A Linguistic Perspective, published 4 years ago. And while I was doing that book, the book actually tried to look at how Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are represented in the British media, the language they use, as I am a linguist. And I wanted to, so I analyzed them, make them linguistic analysis, and the same material that I analyzed linguistically, I sent to the faith communities, and I had focus groups with Muslims, Christians, and I wanted to do focus groups with Jews. And here is the reason I want to share my experience, is that it was quite easy to get Muslim and Christian focus groups ready, but I really, really struggled to get the Jewish focus group. I contacted as many ways as I could, the local synagogues, and even tried to approach through our a Jewish colleague in our Tutu Centre, who used to be the director of the center at that time. And actually, I couldn't organize a focus group. So I had to actually negotiate with my publisher and did some interviews and some questionnaires, because I really, really I was desperate to get the Jewish perspective. Now, when I went to the, have that interviews with a few people, and I actually shared this experience. I said, can you tell me what happened? You know, why I tried my best, I did everything. And in my email to all the synagogues, everything, I said that this is about the representation of the Jewish community in Britain. I'm not interested in Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm not interested in the Middle East. I'm interested in the life of the Jewish community here. Then one of them said something very interesting, and I think, I don't know if Lindsay can give any point from that there are two issues that I think might have affected. One is you have an Arab surname. I'm from Bangladesh, but I have an Arab surname. And secondly, he said that, no, you cannot, there was a problem with your message itself. You cannot separate Israel from the Jewish community. And this experience, actually, in my book, I wrote that the reason for not getting, and my understanding, because I was not, really much aware of the Jewish community, not had much interaction. I had a colleague who was Jewish, who left later on. And interestingly, we had some differences amongst us, but it was nothing to do with religion. It was more professional. And interestingly, of course, when my father passed away, I would never forget that. My father passed away, and I was actually on bereavement leave. She was the person who organized a bereavement card with all the colleagues and posted it to me. So I'm very, very grateful to her. But we had our professional differences. That's different. So, this is such a fascinating that there are differences, there are challenges, but because we don't talk to each other, we don't know each other, this can be an issue. Sorry, I took a bit of a time. I will now close stop the recording and then open it up for questions. So thank you very much on behalf of the Tutu Centre to Julie and Lindsay for the fascinating talk.
Salman, do you want me to respond to you, or shall I just wait now for the other question?